Tonight, we have an extremely exciting and important episode of John Cullen Investigates. We're joined by a prestigious guest who I am honored to welcome back to the show, Dr. Judy Mikovits. Dr. Mikovits, how are you tonight?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you, Jason? John?
I'm very well.
Very well, thank you. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to, because Dr. Judy has done so much tremendous work in educating people to things that, frankly, we can't even really talk about here on YouTube. But people are aware that Dr. Judy has a very storied background, and she is now an author. She's co-authored a number of books. Plague of Corruption is available on Amazon now, and we're going to be talking a bit about her forthcoming book, Ending Plague, A Scholar's Obligation in the Age of Corruption. And regular viewers are, of course, familiar with John Cullen and his ongoing analysis of data from the CDC. We're not questioning the CDC or the WHO, because YouTube hates that. We're actually helping share their information. Right, John?
Well, we're just trying to shed some clarity. And I think the reason I'm so excited about this show tonight is Dr. Judy comes from a particular part of this world, the clinical aspect and working hands-on with all this stuff. I come from a very different part of the world. And before we even get into that, I think the audience needs to know that Dr. Judy and I are meeting for the first time right now. And part of the crowdsource the truth style that Jason likes to do is we don't do like a pre-call together and get to know each other. And so for the benefit of the audience, everything that I'm going to hear from Dr. Judy, everything that Dr. Judy is going to hear from me, you guys are going to get to see our faces as all this happens. So Dr. Judy has all this great information that we're all chomping at the bit to hear. And we have these observations that we've been making. And when I say we, Jason and I have been working on this thing for months, and our audience has been following along and keeping up with this. And the audience that is watching right now is well aware of your work. And in fact, I'd say many in the audience probably already have one or two, maybe 3 or 4 of your books already. So for those who don't know, Dr. Judy has a number of books out, right? And you've been on Crowdsource the Truth before with Jason. I don't know if that video is still available for view.
They never last. YouTube takes them down.
Right. So what we thought we would do in this show was, first of all, I think it's important that we address that all 3 of us who are here on screen right now, we are doing what we're doing kind of for the benefit of others. And if there are people who work at YouTube or Facebook or Twitter or whatever that are misconstruing this and think that our intentions are to stir up trouble or to create some sort of alternate narrative, I just don't understand why people would think that.
Well, I think that Dr. Mikovits...
3 adults coming together that are experts in our fields, that are trying to shed light on what we believe are injustices. And
I think
for people
that Dr.
to think
Mikovits...
anything other than is,
Sorry to interrupt, John.
It drives me nuts. Go ahead.
Dr. Mikovits has had a long career of speaking unpopular truth, and she has been at the business end of the blunting forces of the powers that be. And we want to be very careful about what we discuss during this YouTube segment, because we really just wanted to introduce the audience to tonight's topic, introduce the audience to Dr. Mikovits, and to encourage people to visit Amazon.com and purchase her books. Plague of Corruption is out now. People can pre-order Ending Plague. But I just want to brief both of you and make sure that I understand, John, what the purpose of tonight's show is going to be. Regular viewers will recall that you presented a video not long ago where you had discovered a lecture that was given by some of the scientists who were involved in a CDC effort to revive, to genetically reconstruct the 1918 influenza virus, to basically extract cell tissues from U.S. Army soldiers who had died in World War I of Spanish flu. And by taking genetic material from the lungs of these soldiers who were buried in permafrost and using CRISPR and other genetic engineering tools and techniques, they literally reconstructed the virus. And what we wanted to do was bring in Dr. Judy. She's a very experienced PhD. She's a virologist. She's done so much work. There is no doubt that Dr. Judy can help us understand some of the things that we're looking at as lay people. And that's what we basically want to get into tonight. The first question that I would ask, and I know, Dr. Judy, you weren't involved in this project. You're speaking just as a sort of an expert witness. But are you aware of a scientific purpose, or is one immediately obvious to you as far as resuscitating this incredibly dangerous virus?
I don't see, 20 years ago, I'd have a different answer. I would say so that we could understand how it caused disease and prevent that from ever happening again. That you could understand at the molecular level. That's what I am, a molecular biologist and a biochemist. So we look at immune pathways. We look at who's the most susceptible, what the risks are. So you would want to know, why did people die? And so and another thing your audience might think is fun is, you sent me, Jason, this outline of our discussion for today. I don't know, last night I was watching the football game. It was about 8:00. And I'm like, whoa, no, I missed that email. And I looked at it. And I honestly knew only one of the sections on that. And so what I did is what I always do is I basically, called Dr. Rossetti, who is the lead author on Ending Plague, and said, okay, Frank, what can we learn from the 1918 outbreak? So let's make it a really good, benevolent reason of the CDC and say they want to prevent this from ever happening again. So the topics that you gave us is, okay, who were susceptible? What does all this mean? And I'll let John ask that. So let's give it a benevolent reason that we want to help. If we as scientists understand this, then we can do something. In fact, I pulled a book off the shelf from John Barry, and this is on my shelf. This is my office I'm in. It's a 1-bedroom apartment in Carlsbad where Dr. Rossetti retired, and I don't live here, but I travel here every now and again to work with him. So this book is called The Great Influenza, the epic story of the deadliest plague in history. So I thought, okay, well, and then I texted you earlier today or Skyped you, Jason, and said, hey, I didn't have time to read that last night, so this is going to be fun. So in the last 2 hours, Dr. Rossetti and I sat down as we always did, and this is what's really important, and said, hey, let's try to answer the questions. We're scientists. That's what we do. We understood how HIV caused AIDS, and therefore we prevent, there is no AIDS now. You don't ask about AIDS now. And you can marry these. Why? Because we understood, and this is one of the most important questions about our discussion. The infection is not the disease. SARS-CoV-2 is not COVID-19. There's essentially none that I could think of. There's no infectious agent that I can think of, including influenza in 1918, that was the sole cause of the death. So what else is going on? And that's the kind of question. So who, that you ask. So this is, SARS-CoV-2 doesn't cause COVID-19 because 99.8% of the people who get infected don't have any symptoms at all and certainly aren't dying. So what can we learn? I know.
We're not here to talk about SARS. I don't want to go there because I'm afraid they're going to stop the video in the middle of it.
Well, let's talk about the 1918 flu.
That's what we want to talk about. We want to talk about it's 100 years ago.
Right.
And what happened then. because, and I'll tell you why. So why don't we go to the deck, Jason? So let me kind of put a frame around this because you kind of just jumped to the end.
Okay.
So talking about H1N1 and the resurrection of it is
Right.
the last thing we're talking about tonight. So that'll be with our patrons. Let me walk you through the agenda and explain kind of what we're doing. And certainly, I like I said, I think you're a hero. I'm not here to put you on the spot. I'm here for you to check my math and help us understand, are we getting this right, the stuff that we've been looking at? Because what we're seeing is rather alarming, and it's all coming from the CDC and the WHO. Okay, so if all my data is coming from the CDC and the WHO, I want you, a former CDC senior doctor.
Nope, never worked there. A former National Cancer Institute senior investigator.
Okay. All right, so that's important. Why don't we talk about that? Okay, so can you explain to people the difference between where you did work and were you with Fauci, not with Fauci? What was the background story? Because that matters.
No, never with Fauci. So I worked at the National Institutes of Health literally from the day I graduated from college, my first job, June 10th, 1980. And I went to the National Cancer Institute as a protein chemist to purify type 1 interferon, which is your frontline defense against all RNA viruses. Let's just put it that way, as simple as we can, or most. I don't want to say all because that we don't know that. And so against RNA viruses. And so it was thought, the cover of Time magazine, March 31st, 1980, it was the big if. Is this the magic bullet for cancer? Cancer. I do too, because it was the day before my birthday. My birthday is April Fool's Day. I'm a joke. I'm an identical twin. Yeah, it was a joke for a long time. And this is before there was a sonogram to my family, or travel, or pictures, or cameras. So at any rate, that was what I wanted to do. I said, that's what I want to do when I graduate. And so I took my chemistry degree and I went to the National Cancer Institute as an entry-level technician. This is a BA degree. And I started, this was a 22-year journey at the National Cancer Institute, where in 1983, I graduated from that job to a job called the Biological Response Modifiers Program. That was the first ever translational research institute. And it was, the goal was to use biological response modifiers, help our own immune system work better by any means. Peptide T was what we worked on. My colleague, Frank, our colleague, the late Candace Pert, developed, for AIDS and cancer at the time, because HIV/AIDS wasn't even an HIV/AIDS. It was an acquired immune deficiency. We didn't know there was an HIV associated, that some people, when they got that infection, they developed AIDS. So this,
so early 80s, you're talking 1981, 82, correct. You're talking 83 in that time frame.
Correct.
Right?
And Dr. Judy, when I look up the National Cancer Institute, it's telling us that it's part of the NIH. So didn't Dr. Fauci have some supervisory role over what you were doing, or was he involved in any way at all?
No, because the NIH is the National Institutes of Health. There are 22 of them. One of them was the National Cancer Institute. So I worked for the National Cancer Institute from 1980 to 2001, when I got married and moved to industry in California. So the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease was where Dr. Fauci always worked. So but they were collaborating. Dr. Rossetti, my boss, I'm 22 years old, remember, 22 to 25. My boss, in that first 3 years when Dr. Fauci and I had that interaction everyone's talking about, where he called me up and threatened me. Well, my boss was Frank Rossetti. And my boss was my boss until I took a job, as the last job I had, it was the director of the Lab of Antiviral Drug Mechanisms. And this was an internationally acclaimed job. What my job was to understand AIDS-associated malignancies, develop a program for early diagnosis, mechanism of action, and therapies, immune therapies or drug therapies. therapies, and immune therapies what is at the heart of what I'm passionate about doing and continue to do. I isolate natural products from plants. That was my other first job there, in plants and proteins, biological response modifiers. How do we teach your own immune system to work? So the CDC is not part of the NIH, but it's part of the HHS, Health and Human Services. So they're parallel, where the Centers for Disease Control, the FDA, and the NIH work together. And that's what we see working together, as the Health and Human Services. How are we supposed, the Centers for Disease Control is primarily charged with understanding disease outbreaks and eradicating them. The FDA is Food and Drug Safety primarily, but we know they failed in their job. But anyway.
You're at NIH, and you're at the cancer part of NIH. Fauci's over at the
NIAID, and National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease.
They're like sister divisions, and you said there's 22 of them.
Correct.
So you're in one of them, he's in the other one, but they're both, all these 22 NIHs, who do they roll up to? If not HH, do they roll up to?
They roll up to, the head of HHS is, at this time, is Francis Collins. I don't remember who, NIH. The head of HHS, the oversight of HHS, is the Senate Majority Leader, or the government, the highest levels. They control that. Yes, that's a picture of Francis Collins. So he's the boss of everybody. But these institutes, we collaborate. So, for instance, in HIV/AIDS, heavy collaboration with the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, just as we did with our discoveries of the XMRVs in 2011. It's very important, because what we learned was that susceptible populations weren't who we thought they were in HIV/AIDS. They weren't solely gay men, IV drug users, and prostitutes. They could also, the virus could be transmitted through a contaminated blood supply. And because it's blood cells, white blood cells, that get infected by retroviruses. So so we work together, we collaborate. So in 1984, the NIAID, because of course, it was thought that the cause of AIDS, because of the clusters of disease and the way it went about, was infectious, but it was associated with cancers. And in fact, we there, Dr. Rossetti, Dr. Luc, worked with Luc Montagnier in France, who first isolated a strain of, we called it lymphadenopathy virus because it caused swollen lymph glands. And so and then it was changed to HIV, human immune deficiency, a causative or associated agent of AIDS. So we were there, we were working together. He called Frank, and I was actually in the office for that phone call, and asked, if we could help him confirm the isolation and teach him how to isolate it, because Frank Rossetti and Bernie Poise in 1980 published the first ever isolation and characterization of a disease-causing human retrovirus. Before that time, we were told, don't bother. He was told by John Cullen, don't bother studying human retroviruses. They don't exist. And
I wonder if people have doubts, Dr. Mikovits, about a doctor with the last name Coffin. That's a bit scary.
I don't want to get too far off.
That's okay. That's the conversation. Okay.
But I'm chomping at the bit to find out about your involvement with antivirals, because a big part of where this conversation is going to go is we want to talk about antivirals. We want to talk about oseltamivir. We want to talk about baloxamivir. We want to talk about Avigan and some of the various antivirals and how they're developed, how they're different from one another. In other words, how is a Tamiflu different from a Xofluza versus an Avigan, and that type of thing, right? Just conceptually, we're not making any recommendations to anybody. We're certain, right? So we're not giving, but just the idea of how they work, and then the idea of what the viruses are trying to do to the cells. But I want to get back to the sort of the agenda that we prepared before we go to our patron only hour where we can really dig into the data. I just want to kind of give Dr. Judy an overview because, again, we're meeting for the first time, and you just shared a whole bunch of your background with the audience. And you're probably wondering, all right, so why am I talking to this guy with the hat and the sunglasses? And what is he? Well, and that's okay. It's funny because Charles wears a hat on the weekends and nobody gives him grief about the hat.
Right.
So it's clearly the sunglasses. But my background has to do with that map. So if you go to the next page, Jason, real quick, I want to show Dr. Judy just a couple pages in the deck. And so one of the questions that, you may be saying, why are we doing this show and really not getting into the big topic that everybody around the world is freaking out about? Why does this guy want to talk about the flu? Why are we talking about influenza from 100 years ago, from 1918? What isn't that like talking about the World Series from 1947? I mean, it seems a little bit kind of strange. Why would we go there?
Because baseball's still baseball?
Well, sort of.
And there are rules to the game.
Right.
Well, that's the
excellent
key.
point.
There's rules to the game. There's rules to the game. And so what you're going to hear now for the first time is that this map that you've seen on television. Can you go to the next page, Jason? I think the next page. Oh, yeah, let's go back then. All right, so the map that you've seen on TV, I helped put that together 30 years ago. So I'm a whistleblower.
Okay.
I built this thing. All right, now I didn't build this iteration of it, but I put the map and the database that's running on together 30 years ago. Right? I'm kind of the architect of this system. And when Jason asks me to look into this and says, there's something more going on here than bat soup. This is not some kid touched a bat in a wet market. There's something going on here. And so as soon as I saw the system and I saw the map, it would be like if somebody brought something back to you that you had worked on early in your career. Right. And so this was 30 something years ago. I built this thing. This is late 80s. Okay.
Very cool.
Like
okay.
88. All right. So Jason says to me, you got to look, you got to check this out. So I go to the map, and how long would it take you if somebody brought you one of your old research projects and took it out of the drawer, literally from 25, 30 years ago, and handed it to you? That's what they did here. I took one look at this and said, why is Vietnam red? Why is Cambodia red? Why is Laos red? There's nobody dead there. If there's nobody dead in Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, how is this a global pandemic? There's 24.5 million people on Taiwan and 7 are dead. Nobody's looking in the right place, Dr. Judy.
Right.
Everybody's looking where they want you to look. Everybody's looking in Italy and France and Spain. And I'm looking at Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. And I'm looking at Mongolia.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're getting very close to the end of our segment here. And I want to make sure, first of all, that people watching are aware we're going to be getting in depth with Dr. Judy Mikovits in just about 5 minutes on Subscribestar and Patreon. People who are already sponsors of the show can join us for that exclusive content. Other people can go to subscribestar.com/I am John Cullen, patreon.com/I am John Cullen, or Subscribestar or Patreon/crowdsource the truth. And it's also very important for our viewers to check out Dr. Judy's book, Plague of Corruption. If you haven't already read it, you're going to want to make your way over to Amazon.com or perhaps a retailer that's not controlled by the CIA, but purchase the book, Plague of Corruption, Restoring Faith in the Promise of Science. And also, we want to make sure everybody knows that Dr. Judy has a new book coming out in April of next year. You can pre-order it now. This book is titled Ending Plague, A Scholar's Obligation in the Age of Corruption. John, give us about a 1-minute wrap-up, and then we'll be off to the sponsor-exclusive segment.
Sure. So let's just go back to the deck real quick, go to the next slide, and we'll go 2 slides, and we'll wrap it up and go sponsor. So Dr. Judy, I spent the early part of my career at Oracle,
Ah,
and I went into the CDC's database, and it's open. I didn't have to hack it. It's wide open to the public. So there's no laws that have been broken here. And that's kind of what makes me a threat, is I haven't broken any laws.
right,
I just went in and got the data, and it's wide open.
right.
And we started breaking it down. And Jason, if you go to the next slide, what happened was Laura Ingraham from Fox News tweeted it and
Oh,
said, why are we closing the schools if there's 39 kids in the country that are dead between 5 and 14 years old? And at the time it was 31, now it's 39. So we were breaking the data down in a way that no one was doing. We were going to the CDC and going to the mortality and getting the data, not from the doctors, but from the coroners. And so what we're going to share with you tonight are our observations from the data that we've been pulling, but not so much on coronavirus. I just wanted you to see this just to know that's kind of where I have been working for the last 10 months, is on this. But I wanted to talk to you about the Spanish flu, about H1N1 from 1918, and about the reconstruction of it that went on at Walter Reed. Dr. Jeff Taubenberger and Reed, the work that they did to recreate that virus. We've got a bunch of video clips already queued up for tonight for our patrons. So we've got about 5 or 6 different video clips. We're going to be talking about cytokine storms and the fact that the cytokine storm, which is one of the defining characteristics of this current pandemic, was also a defining characteristic of the Spanish flu. So these are the things we're going to dig into, and this is where we want you to help us comprehend this, because we just sort of have like data point, and we think you're the one that's going to be able to just tie this together and go, oh my God, how did you guys find this stuff? Because this is compelling. So
We've got to make the switch here over to this sponsor exclusive platform. We were just about out of time. So I want to thank everybody for tuning in, and we'll be back with Dr. Mikovits in less than 5 minutes. Join us on Patreon and Subscribe Star.